I'm the City Switch Program Manager at the City of Sydney, and really excited for this first part in our climate resilience series. The second part being next Tuesday at the same time, if you haven't already signed up. Can see a few more people joining us now, which is amazing. Could you flick me onto that next slide there, Alex? Thank you. I'll start today by acknowledging that I'm on Gadigal country, Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the local area here, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd love to invite you all to also drop in which country you're on today, as well as your name and business name, just so we can get to know who's in the room and where you're coming from. That would be amazing. And I'll also note that this webinar will be recorded today. We have a City Switch YouTube channel, so it'll appear up there, and it will also appear on the City Switch website, cityswitch.net.au, under our resources section. So look out for that. And I'll just invite you again to drop your name and which country you're coming from today in our chat. That would be amazing. Hi, Andy. Thank you. So we will be using the chat today. You can drop comments in there throughout. We'll also be using the Q&A function. So if you have any questions for ResilientCo, please drop them in the Q&A, and then they'll be answered either during the session or at the end of the session. We'll have 10 minutes for dedicated Q&A. So we'd love to hear from you if you've got any questions coming through. Amazing. So I can see a few people are saying hello, which is great. And Alex, I'll ask you to flick on. So before I hand over to ResilientCo, I'll just take a moment to introduce you to City Switch. Many of you are members, but there's a few newbies joining us. City Switch is a free program for businesses, and we're here to help you accelerate your journey to net zero. So we structure that journey. We provide resources along every step. We provide best practice, the opportunity to connect with one another, and get that peer-to-peer learning, and also through our annual reporting to support you to be accountable and to track that progress. Next slide. So I'm in the City of Sydney. We do have the City of Melbourne, North Sydney, Yarra, Ballarat, Port Phillip, and support from neighbours. And we are a national program, so we welcome businesses to join us from around the country. There's 180 members, about 10% of Australian office space signed up to the program, but plenty of room for more businesses to join us. And next slide there. This is our pathway. This is how we structure the program, how we deliver resources, how we encourage businesses to connect on how they're travelling on each piece. And today, as we all know, it's about climate resilience. So you'll see that right at the bottom there. Not that it should be right at the bottom of your journey, but we do recognise that it's quite an emerging topic, and often just the leaders in the space at the moment are addressing climate resilience. So really excited to be touching on this topic today in our webinar series today, next Tuesday, and then some accompanying educational guides to come out as well. I'll hand over now to ResilientCo, and there's a slide there, Alex, just to intro you. So we've got Brett Ellis, he's the Managing Director, and Alex Dudley, the Climate Resilience Specialist, to take you through their presentation today. Thank you both.
Thanks, Em. Hi all. Yeah, my name's Brett Ellis. I'm the Managing Director at ResilientCo. I'm here with a few of the team. So Alex, who's going to lead most of today, Shahani's in the background, and Lucy's there as well. We're an organisation that works predominantly in sort of the disaster, community resilience, climate change, adaptation, sort of all that space. But we're an organisation too that puts back a lot back into society as well. So we've also stood up a non-for-profit just recently called the Resilience Canopy, which is doing a lot of work within the community resilience space. So really trying to look at how we support not only businesses and governments, but also how we support communities to be, lean into the challenges that we are continually seeing and will continue into the future. Alex is going to lead most of today. Alex has got an amazing background. She's finishing off her second master's at Melbourne Uni in evaluation, but also has a master's in the environmental sort of risk area, climate change, which she achieved at Bonn University over in Germany. So I'll jump on towards the end of the session and take you through some of the lessons and view of some of the business continuity things that we're seeing across Australia, but I'll hand over to Alex.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it. So thanks everybody for coming today. Really appreciate you taking the time. To get started, I'd like you to answer in the poll. Emily, if you could launch that one up. Which sector or business type do you work in? This will just help us get an idea of who's in the room and what you do. So Emily's loaded up that poll and you can just type in your response and we'll see what comes through. Awesome. I can see local government, real estate, property, council, accounting, events, sustainability, management consulting. Fabulous. Looks like real estate and local government are dominating at the moment. Some health sector there, property sector. Awesome. We've got 31 responses, which is nearly everyone. So yeah, it definitely looks like it's mainly local government, real estate and property. Really great to have everyone here. Hopefully you get something out of this presentation, regardless of what sector you're in. It is intended to be relatively general because obviously City Switch's membership is quite broad and cover all of Australia as well. So today we'll be talking about three key things. The first one is climate risk and understanding climate risk and how it could impact your organisation. The second thing is climate resilience and why building resilience to climate change is increasingly critical for all businesses. And then the third part of the presentation will go more into the solution space and practical guidance on how your business can become more resilient to climate change in both the short and long term. Emily did mention before that an educational guide and a practical resource is currently in development and will be available on the City Switch website soon. So do invite you to take a look. The package of these webinars and these tools should hopefully help you build climate resilience for your business. So I think we're probably, if we're here, we're all aware that climate-related risks have shifted from what was seen as a long-term concern to an urgent reality. The World Economic Forum surveys global leaders across multiple industries each year. And in 2025, the results from this survey found that extreme weather events was the first ranked risk by severity in the long term. And they define long term as 10 years. So in my perspective, that's relatively short term. And this was the second year in a row that it had been ranked at the top. I think something else interesting to take away from this survey is that the natural related risks are featuring right up the top, and they're all really interconnected and connected to climate change. So climate change connects in with extreme weather events, it connects in with biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and it connects in with critical change to Earth's ecosystems and other systems. So climate related risks are now something that are really important to address for a multitude of reasons. Earlier this year, the National Climate Risk Assessment was released by the Australian government, and it confirms the devastating consequences of climate change for Australia as well. So in that report, it found that by 2049, 2050, there could be up to $40.3 billion worth of annual social and financial costs from floods, bushfires, storms, cyclones, and hailstorms. And that's in a 1.5 degree world, which in my pessimistic opinion, we'll be lucky to achieve that. I think we're heading for more like a 2, 3, maybe even 4 degree world. Additionally, it found that there could be 700,000 to 2.7 million additional working days that could be lost to heat waves each year by 2061. And for me, this is a bit more of a realistic temperature range that we're looking at here. So 3 degrees to over 3 degrees of warming. And then it also looked at the insured losses from declared insurance catastrophes in 2020 and 2024 and found that it was 0.7% of the GDP in 2024. And I think the important thing to take away from that point is that in 1995 to 2000, it was only 0.2% of the GDP. So it is the insured losses from declared insurance catastrophes are increasing over time and they are becoming more expensive. Australia is obviously an enormous country and it is exposed to frequent and significant and varied natural hazard events due to its variable climate, geography and environment. In the National Climate Risk Assessment, they defined 10 key hazards to look at of key importance to Australia. And these ranged from bushfires and grass fires to changes in temperature, such as heat waves and cold snaps, coastal and estuarine flooding, coastal erosion and shoreline change, convective storms, drought and changes in aridity, extratropical storms, ocean warming and acidification, riverine and flash flooding, and tropical cyclones. And I'm going to take a moment and indulge myself here a little bit to go a little bit into the science between what the difference between some of these hazards are, because convective storms, extratropical storms, the layperson might not necessarily know what the difference is here. But it is important to think about when we're thinking about climate change because they do behave differently. So convective storms are driven by rising hot air. So we can think about afternoon thunderstorms on a summer hot day. They form when hot surface air rises rapidly and it creates clouds. So those cumulonimbus clouds, the big fluffy clouds we see in the sky, they release their energy quickly and intensely, typically as heavy rain, potentially hail, often accompanied by lightning. Convective storms are typically quite small and localized and short-lived, so range from a few minutes to a few hours. In Australia, when we're thinking about convective storms, we're thinking about the severe summer thunderstorms that Sydney and Melbourne experience nearly yearly now. Extratropical storms, on the other hand, are also known as mid-latitude cyclones, and they're driven by different mechanisms. So they're driven by when a cold air mass collides with a warm air mass, and this creates a large rotating low pressure system. These are often much bigger, they're much more long-lived and can last over a week. They typically have a broader impact, and importantly, they're cool season events. So they're most common in autumn, winter and spring. So when we're thinking about examples in Australia, we can think of the winter cold fronts crossing southern Australia and the east coast lows. So we've got those convective storms, which are the summer storms, and the extratropical storms, which are typically the cooler weather storms. We also have tropical cyclones, which kind of ties in with this storm theme. These are often in Northern Australia and are warm season events as well. So now we've dipped into hazards and the different hazards that Australia might experience. I would like everybody to take a moment and go back to the polls and think about which hazard do you think your business should be most concerned about. So there's a selection there. You can pick as many as you like. Up to 3 would be great. If there's more, that's fine. If there's less, that's also fine. But it'd be interesting to see what people think here about the hazards their businesses should be most concerned about. And do note that you can scroll. So if you can't see all the options, you can scroll. So it looks like if we're looking at the results, we've got changes in temperature, bushfires, convective storms, seem to be the ones pulling ahead. Few people there are concerned about tropical cyclones and riverine flooding. Somebody is concerned about ocean warming and acidification. Awesome. Yeah, that's a really interesting spread. Nothing I'm terribly surprised about. Heat waves are particularly damaging for Australia and are actually the deadliest natural hazard in the world. So that's good that that one came out as the one that's most important, because it is certainly very important to think about. Great. So far we've been thinking mainly about the climate-related hazards that might impact a business: floods, bushfires, heat waves, and storms. But when we do think about climate risk, we need to think about it in terms of three different concepts. There's the hazard, which does need to be there, but there's also exposure, and these are valued elements that could be affected by the hazard. So in the case of an office-based business, we might be thinking about key staff, we might be thinking about security systems, power, communication systems, specialized equipment. It's the things that you rely on for your business to operate effectively. At the same time, we also need to consider this thing called vulnerability. And vulnerability is mediating factors that determine the extent of harm experienced by the exposed element. So say we have a security system, it's exposed to the impacts from natural hazards. If you do not have business plans and backup systems in place to manage when a security system goes offline, then your business is particularly vulnerable. If you had really excellent, very robust, extensive business plans and backup systems, then your security system and your business vulnerability to your security system going down would be much less. So you need these three things in play when you're considering risk. You need the hazard, you need the exposed element, and you need to consider vulnerability. And this framework helps us think about how to reduce risk as well. So we'll go into this in a bit more detail further on, but just quickly now, when we're thinking about reducing risk, you can either reduce your exposure, and typically this is seen as relocating assets and equipment and maybe even your building. So you're taking away the ability for that hazard to harm the valued thing that you care about. Or you can have actions that reduce vulnerability. And these are things you're building up the factors that keep your business functioning. So building in those redundancies and plans and processes so that if your security system or power system does go down for a period of time, your business is not as impacted as it might have been without those plans and processes in place. Up until now, we've mainly been focusing on the physical risks, so acute risks such as floods, storms and bushfires, and chronic risks such as sea level rise. And these are the climate change hazards directly or indirectly impacting on your business. But we can also think about transition risks and liability risks. And we should be thinking about these risks when we're thinking about climate resilience. So transition risks arise from changes as the world adjusts to a lower carbon economy, and these could be policy changes, new technologies, market shifts and the like. We often hear in the news about how different renewable energy systems and technology isn't progressing at a rate that we would like to see necessarily, because there's all of this risk in the system that the policy could change, that a new technology could come in that creates this risk that there'll be some financial impacts for your business. Then we also have liability risks, and these arise from the potential for litigation when a business does not adequately respond to climate change. So this could be, for example, not adequately disclosing your climate risks, which is now particularly important with the recent sustainability reporting legislation. So with climate risk and climate resilience, it's important to think about your physical risks, your transition risks, and your liability risks. The impacts from climate risks from either of these three types can be significant and prolonged, and typically we can think about them as direct and indirect. Direct impacts to business from climate change and climate risks could be injuries and health risks to your employees, damage to your office building, and loss or damage to your office equipment. Indirect impacts might include things like supply chain disruptions. So say you're a business down in Melbourne, but you rely on importing things from ports in Darwin or up in the north of Australia. If they were impacted, you would be impacted indirectly through that supply chain linkage there. So your business, your premises, your employees might not be directly impacted, but your business is still impacted through this linkage. And this links in with thinking about cascading impacts. So when you're thinking about climate risks for your business, you can think about them in terms of impact chains. A single climate event doesn't just impact one thing, particularly within a business context, but it can cause cascading disruptions across people, operations, supply chain, finances, and reputation. And when we see these cascading risks moving through a system, often the impacts can amplify the disruption far beyond the initial event. And that could be amplifying in time. It could make the event last a lot longer for your business, or the impacts of the event last a lot longer for your business, or scale. It could make the impacts, could make it far more expensive to come back and resume normal operations. So these impact chains are a helpful way to kind of mind map how climate risk can cascade through the different areas of your business. So we've got the last activity for today, and we've just touched on these. So it would be great to understand for your business which type of risk is most important for your business to address, in your opinion. Would it be physical risk, transition risk, or liability risk? And we'll get everybody just to select the one. Thank you to everybody that's responding. Looks like transition risk is slightly pulling ahead, but only marginally at this stage. Great. So we might stop it there, and we can see that transition risk is the risk that most people are concerned about, relatively closely followed by physical risk and then liability risk down there. So a relatively even spread, which is quite interesting. So we'll move into a bit more of the solution space now. For us, we obviously think that building climate resilience is increasingly critical for all organisations to manage risks and capture opportunities. Our definition of climate resilience for business is an organisation's ability to survive, adapt and thrive amid increasing climate disruptions. It's about your capacity to withstand climate-related shocks and stresses, whether that's a flood or legislation change, while maintaining operations and competitiveness. The key steps that people and businesses can undertake to understand climate risks is undertaking a risk assessment. So you do the risk assessment to understand what types of risks your organisation could face, and you really make sure you focus throughout your value chain and consider those cascading risks and impacts. Once you've done that, you can develop an adaptation plan, and these might be strategic actions that focus on the highest or most priority risks. But you can also develop a business continuity plan or integrate climate considerations into existing business continuity plans. And these can help you manage the short-term disruptions to critical functions that are happening all the time now. So this is a little bit less forward-looking and more about thinking about your critical functions and what your business needs now to continue functioning in a changing climate. And then once you've done all of this, it's really important to integrate climate risks and adaptation strategies into core business. So your risk and response to climate change shouldn't just sit with your sustainability team. It should really be integrated back into your core strategy, governance, and risk management processes. Touching on the risk assessment process. So there's typically 3 different levels of risk assessment that we can see, depending on the capacity and size of your business and the extent of climate risk that you foresee. A first one is a high level pass, a first pass risk assessment. It's fairly high level. It can also be called a sensitivity assessment, and it just really simply explores which climate hazards and physical transition and liability risks might affect the business. The second pass risk assessment is much more comprehensive and more closely mirrors what a standard risk assessment process might look like for your business, thinking about likelihood and consequences. And the International Standards Organization provides a good process for this, where you think about the context, you identify your risks, you analyze them, thinking about likelihood and consequence. You evaluate them, so determine which ones need to be addressed. And then you develop treatment plans and treat those risks. Importantly, this is a really consultative process. You do need to bring in a lot of stakeholders. You should be engaging with your executive as well. And it's can often be relatively qualitative. So it's more about getting consensus about these different ratings to prioritize risks. A third pass risk assessment is much more detailed and is often for a specific component of your value chain. So if we're thinking about a business and they do a second pass risk assessment and they identify our supply chains are at extreme risk and we'd like to know more, you might move that into the third pass risk assessment and get a specific assessment done for your supply chain. And in that assessment, you might have climate modelling, you might have transport modelling, you might have economic modelling, and it really gives you that deeper insight into the risk that you're facing from climate change within your supply chain. Once we have undertaken the risk assessment, businesses can develop strategies to address the risks and develop a plan. And typically we see these strategies falling into 4 buckets. The first one is mitigation. So this is reducing the likelihood or impact of the risk. So you might develop a BCP, business continuity plan. You might decarbonize your operations. We can transfer risk, which is about shifting risk burden to another party. Insurance is the very typical, relatively easily understood way to transfer risk. So your insurer is taking on that risk. If something happens, they have to pay, not you. You've transferred the risk. You can control your risks. So this is implementing ongoing measures to manage the risks, which might be conducting regular climate risk assessments, setting KPIs and targets, potentially running business continuity exercises to make sure your business can continue functioning through a disruption. And then the last bucket is accepting the risk. So this is retaining the risk with or without action. So you might have a risk and you say, yes, we acknowledge that that is a risk for us, but we have adequate financial reserves to buffer that risk, in our opinion, and so we're going to take no action. And then you're accepting the risk. I'm going to pass on to Brett now, who's going to talk more about business continuity planning as a way to manage those disruptions to your business that could happen anytime from now and into the future, regardless of climate change. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Alex. I will just touch on a little bit and just link some parts of this up. One of my previous roles was in charge of the state risk profile for Victoria. So part of that role was to look at all the potential challenges and hazards and all the consequences of those, that all the types of things that might actually cripple the state of Victoria. So what we have been seeing over the increasing probably couple of decades is compounding risks where we get a particular hazard might impact into another critical function or a critical piece of infrastructure that then takes out significant capacity within the system. So a good example of that is, say, a bushfire. And a bushfire is a bushfire, but if you have that bushfire then enters into the coal mine, which happened down in Morwell, you've suddenly got a fire in a coal mine as well, which then throws up a whole lot of pollution and a whole range of other consequences flow out from that. So it's no longer just a bushfire, it's taking out power infrastructure, it's taking out, throwing up a whole significant layer of health issues as well. So we're seeing more of those type of events play out now as society becomes more complex and as the severity of these disasters, or hazards are impacting into communities and cities. In relation to that, we do a lot of work with organisations before, during and after, but by doing the after, we get to look at where things have fallen over. Business continuity, I know there's a lot of people here from local government, but local government's a great example from a business continuity point of view, is that the business continuity plans that you would get off the shelf to implement within local government actually don't work for local government. They do for those incidents where you have, you might have the depot is offline because of an incident at the depot, but what the business continuity plans don't take into consideration is all the additional services that a local government needs to do when we see a major disaster playing out within its community. So those most business continuity plans that I see within local government actually don't respond to the fact that they now need to run evacuation centres, or we'll have to have a whole range of additional services like tree services or local laws or rangers having to be deployed, and the business continuity plans don't consider that. So in relation to business continuity, and this is for all businesses, how we tend to work through is really that first part is really to scope out, what is the type of business, what are the processes and functions that are key to the business. We then undertake what we call a business impact assessment, and what we're trying to identify through this is what are the critical functions. And what I mean by critical functions, what are those things that you cannot drop the ball on, and if you do drop the ball on, it will either impact the organisation significantly financially, legally, health and safety, so it'll either kill or injure your people. So it's looking at those key things that will, if they stop, they will impact. We're also in that space, we're also looking at the time with that. So some businesses and some of those critical functions will be able to operate, or you won't need to operate for a period of time. But, if that goes beyond 24 hours or beyond a week or beyond a month, the business then will suffer. So it's really understanding that maximum acceptable outage for those critical functions. Within that system, then we start to look at those critical functions as the key focus, and then look at what are the redundancies, the workarounds, the mitigations that you can put in place to keep those critical functions in place. So again, if we pick up local laws, if we pick up local government, one of the examples might be Meals on Wheels. So if a local government's providing Meals on Wheels to the community, obviously that's a critical function. They cannot not do that. If they're not providing their meals to those people, then people get hungry. So the redundancies to that are, well, then what are the systems and processes? What are the backups? Do we have another service provider that could provide that? Where are the risks and systems that, or what are the things that could fall over? As well as that, within this, we're also looking at within those critical functions, probably the key things and vulnerabilities, or what are the key things that are needed to keep that critical function operating. So do they need IT? Do they need a building? Do they need a key fleet? Is there specialised equipment they need? Do they need communication? So we tend to work through those lists and identify what are those dependencies that we need to keep that system going, and work out what the minimum requirement for that is. So is that 2 people and a telephone, or is that 2 people, the oven, and and a vehicle to get the meals out if we're picking on Meals on Wheels. So the whole system starts to really look down at what are those key critical functions, what are the dependencies to keep those critical functions going, and then what are the workarounds. So if you lose communications, what is your redundancy? Do you have can you go to VoIP, voice over IP, for instance? If Telstra is down, can you go to the internet? If you lose your internet, can you go to mobile? So it's really working through all that. That then starts to identify the business continuity plan. So what are those key areas you need to focus? But your business continuity plan also needs to consider what happens, how do you come together as an organisation and manage that event. And then obviously there's test and maintain. Thanks, Alex. This is just an example, and what we're seeing more and more now, and I think as organisations put more and more dependence into communications and particularly internet. We're seeing that become a significant challenge when we have major disasters. So we saw that play out just recently in Brisbane with the storm that came through, but we also have seen that more and more. A great example was up in Yarra Ranges down in Victoria, where they had that storm event that played out at, I think it was at 11 o'clock at night. A major storm came through the Dandenongs and came across the Melbourne and then impacted into Macedon Ranges as well. Because of that storm played out at 11 o'clock at night, everyone had communication still because the mobile telecommunications were still working. The power had gone out because all the power had, the trees had come down across the lines. But what people didn't realise is by 8 o'clock in the morning, the battery backup on the mobile telecommunications towers had actually depleted. So there was no mobile communications, and because power was out, your internet was also out at home and your business as well. If you had power reliance on your internet, most people do, unless you've got cable to the building. And then you still need to have power at the building to keep that internet on. So by 8 o'clock in the morning, because the mobile telecommunication towers had depleted their power, they had no internet and no power at home. Most of the businesses and homes were without communications at all. So no one was being able to communicate from the impacted zones back out to call for help or pass on information around the severity of that incident. So what ended up playing out for that area was they were without power for up to 6 days. But once you take out internet, obviously that takes out your FPOS system. So all businesses, they can't transact with FPOS because the internet's down, power's out. So it went back to a cash supply. So people having to go and find money and not being able to actually get money out of the ATMs either because they weren't working. So we went back to the dark ages for basically a week across the Yarra Valley. So that takes banking out, your mobile telecommunications out, obviously logistics starts to impact and transport. So this is just an example. I think most businesses have considered, hey, if we have power out, what are our redundancies? But I think the challenges that we're seeing those those events actually increasing in time. So it's not just about having power out for 24 hours. What does that look like if you're without power for a week? And what are the redundancies? Where do we need power? And how do we work around that? So that's just one example of what we're seeing play out more and more. And obviously climate change is a big influence into this space, but it's as we build our dependency as well into certain infrastructure or certain requirements. And a good example is for yourselves too. I say this to a lot of people, particularly in the community resilient space. But if you were, if you had been locked away, as in you couldn't leave your home for a period of time, how long could you survive without power? And most people don't last very long because we're so used to now being able to go down to 7-Eleven and get the milk, 24 hours a day, where what we've been seeing is major impacts, which actually throw a lot of that business as usual up in the air, and that's impacting obviously business at its core. So the work, if closing up on this, but the work around business continuity, you really need to look at what are those critical functions you cannot drop the ball on, and then what are the dependencies that you need to keep and have redundancy for to keep the lights on or keep those critical functions operating.
Great, thanks, Brett. So we are heading towards the end of the webinar now. I'd like to invite people to ask questions. There is a Q&A function. You can also type them into the chat. Emily, I'm not seeing any questions come through the Q&A at this stage, but please do feel free to ask questions for either myself or Brett. But yeah, so essentially what we've covered today is that climate-related risks are now a urgent and immediate challenge for all businesses. It's no longer a long-term distant concern that we can kind of say, oh, look, we'll plan for 2050. Cool, great, thank you. Climate change has already happened. It is already affecting extreme weather events. And we do need to plan for impacts that could happen tomorrow. We're heading into the severe weather season right now, December, January, February, March. We need to be prepared for what could happen in the coming months, let alone what could happen 2050, 2070 down the line. When we're thinking about climate-related risks, we can think about physical, transition and liability risks. So physical risks are those climate hazards that directly impact onto your business. The transition risks are more about policy changes, new technologies and markets, and consumer preference changes might also fall into that category. And then liability risk is the risk of being blamed or sued for either not doing your due diligence and disclosing your risks appropriately, or if you do know your risks and you can't deliver on your contracts or things like that, that falls under liability risk. When we're thinking about climate resilience for business, we are talking about an organisation's ability to survive, adapt and thrive amid climate disruptions. And climate disruptions, as mentioned, is not just the floods, the bushfires, the storms. Climate disruptions can also be a changing policy landscape, new technology, and so on. And then because of this, building climate resilience is really essential for organisations. And we have focused a little bit on the doom and gloom today and about managing risks and impacts, but I think it's also pertinent to highlight that managing climate risks can enable your business to seize new opportunities and gain strategic advantage as well. So if you're managing your risks really effectively and your company is known for being able to deliver despite the turbulent times that we live in, then you might gain the competitive advantage there. And then the last point there are the key actions that every business should take to address current and future climate risks. So that includes doing that risk assessment, developing an adaptation plan, developing a business continuity plan, and then integrating these considerations into business as usual risk management processes, strategy and governance. In order to do this effectively, stakeholder engagement is really key, particularly with executives and managers. And they might not know, and we have heard that there can be pushback from those higher level executives who think that climate change is kind of a distant concern. It's very hard to challenge, to manage. There's a lot of uncertainty, which there absolutely is. It's a risk topic, so it's all based on probabilities. But it is really important for businesses to address to be able to thrive into the future. So again, I'll invite everybody to put questions into the Q&A box. And I can see one there about what climate scenarios should businesses plan for. So this is a really great question. And we do get it quite a lot. I think it's important to highlight that Australia has warmed by 1.5 degrees compared to 1910 when records began already. So planning for 1.5 essentially means planning for now, which means you need to think about the climate hazards that you've already experienced and also your near misses, and plan for those. And when we're thinking about future projections, I mentioned before, I'm a little bit pessimistic in this space, but I would be planning for the 3-4 degree world. And then if the world comes together and cooperates and we do manage to reduce emissions and keep global warming to below 2 degrees, well, then that's a bonus for everybody. The Sydney Water has a really great adaptation plan and framework where they look at what the impacts could be under a high emissions scenario. And then if they cannot adjust whatever they're doing to manage those impacts, then they need to build that redundancy into the infrastructure today. So they take a bit of an adaptation pathway approach, which gives them the flexibility to plan for a emissions scenario, but then if things do get worse, they can pivot. And if they identify that they can't pivot, then they need to integrate that high emissions thinking into their infrastructure today. So that's another way to think about it as well. But it's a really great plan. It's online. Do recommend having a look if you're trying to work out how to do this in a cost-effective way, because obviously that's a consideration for everybody as well. So I see a question there on carbon accounting. That's a really interesting question. So today we've mainly been speaking about climate resilience and climate change adaptation, and I think this is a really good point to highlight the difference between the two. So climate change mitigation is about reducing your emissions to kind of reduce the amount of climate change that we experience as a globe. Climate change adaptation is about making adjustments to your business processes, plans, policies, infrastructure, assets, and so on to reduce the impacts from climate change. So from those floods, from the heat waves, from policy changes in technology. So they are slightly separate topics. And I do know that City Switch has some fantastic resources online about that mitigations piece. So I'd invite you to go and take a look at those resources there. And then I can see a question there about inability to get insurance cover for certain councils and individuals. This is a really interesting and challenging question that I don't think there's any easy answers for at this stage. It's something that I know the federal government's working on about insurance affordability. Brett, did you have any insights there?
No, but it is getting more and more difficult, and we'll need to sort of again lean into this space more and more, all of us, as insurance becomes unaffordable. But I think every individual, every business, every home, every spot is uniquely different. So it really is a question for yourselves to work through, what are your vulnerabilities, and what are those workarounds that you can do to limit your exposure. So ultimately insurance is one way to assure that, if you lose your home or you lose your business, you can build another one, or keeps you afloat while you are building another one. But the other option is to, potentially say, is that exposure so great that we probably need to move or do other things to that, if that's in relation to building, to shore up that building, to make sure it doesn't burn down or get flooded or whatever it happens to be, the exposure. But the challenge in this space, every business, every home, every individual is uniquely different.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Did we have any other questions, Emily, in the background that we haven't addressed or can't see?
Yeah, there's a couple in the Q&A.
Okay, fabulous.
So I wanted to ask, what type of roles within a business are usually involved in developing the BCP? And can we talk to both a small business and a larger corporate size as well?
Yeah,
Right,
it's
I'll
probably
pass that to
with
you.
me. Yeah, so with, say, let's pick on a complex organisation such as local government. So local governments obviously will have a risk department. They'll tend to be leading the process. But where I see most businesses will fall over is they don't engage with all the senior management, the managers at that middle tier level across the organisation. But everyone that's running a section of the business really needs to be fully engaged in business continuity, looking at what are the workarounds, what are the things they need to do and have in place to keep their critical functions going. So all around people, IT systems, keeping the lights on, whatever it happens to be. But every manager across the organisation needs to be party to that. In a small business, obviously that comes, depending on the size of the business, it really comes back to the executive really looking at what are those, and being responsible for that as well. Again, different businesses have different exposures, with working from home now being available for many organisations where it wasn't available 10 years ago. Working from home has alleviated a whole range of challenges that we've traditionally seen in the business continuity space. but has added a whole range of other additional challenges in around electricity and internet and exposure from risks and cybersecurity and a whole range of other things that are now risks that need to be core to our considerations around BCP. So in a nutshell, it'd be all the middle management for those bigger organisations need to be heavily involved and feeding up into that executive level. In the smaller business, that really sits with the owners and the senior people.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Brett, just on sustainability roles and managers who I know probably make up a large chunk of the audience today as well. Have you seen in your work sustainability roles being invited to get involved in that process now, or do you still think there's a bit of a lack of kind of cross-sector involvement?
Yeah, I think the sustainability people come with a unique set of skills, potentially because they're looking at the future. They tend to be people that are looking at the future and looking at the exposures and potentially what's coming. So again, in that informing the actual actions and the business continuity plans, which is really the response to and the mitigations to, they definitely help with those broader risk strategies to reduce the risk. During an incident, they're people that can be deployed into other areas as well. So you can move those types of people around. They have a skill set that can be adaptive. So they become the other, probably just reflecting too on the question as well. There are in a lot of organisations too what I classify as the spine of the organisation. So those are the, again, if I pick on local government, it's the communications team, it's the IT team, it's the fleet managers, it's the building facility operators, it's the call centre. Finance and HR. So they're all that corporate services functions of the organisation are key to actually identifying where the risks are, or where, but then also in the heat of the battle is they become critical to being able to move people or keep systems functioning. So don't underestimate the importance of that spine within the organisation on keeping your business operating during events.
Thanks, Brett.
Well, I can jump in with just another question. Is there any sector-specific information out there on climate risk? I know in our guide we'll point to some location-specific physical risks that people can use, but is there anything sector-specific that's been developed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So different industry bodies have typically created some sector-specific guidance. So Property Council of Australia, the National Farmers Association, and different industry associations provide different sector-specific risk assessments and kind of suites of adaptation options. There's also, I know the Victorian government has created sector-specific adaptation plans, so it might be worth having a look at those. And then there are also banks of kind of adaptation actions that align with different sectors out there. It does take a little bit of Googling, a little bit of searching, but you can kind of have a look and see what people are doing. Particularly the ones that I'm aware of are over in the US, and they can give some sector-specific ideas for adaptation options.
Great, thanks, Alex. That's all the questions that have come through in the Q&A. Obviously, we have a little bit more time if anyone else would like to ask a question of Alex or Brett.
So I can see one more there about why should office-based businesses build resilience when often those buildings are leased? And I think that's a really interesting question for this group of people, because it's absolutely right that often it's the landlord's responsibility to manage the building structure and major systems within the building. But I do think it's important for businesses to acknowledge that you're responsible for your business continuity, as we just said, your employees' safety during work hours, and that could be seriously affected by climate change, particularly particularly if you do have workers who work outdoors. You're responsible for your equipment and data, as well as your supply chain resilience. So while it may feel like you don't have a lot that you can do, you do actually have quite a bit of leverage to make sure that your business is resilient to climate change. You can also request information about climate risks from your landlords and push for building improvements, or factor resilience into your leasing decisions as well. So if you're looking to lease a new building, perhaps one that's not in a floodplain or has the appropriate measures and adaptations in place so that if it does flood, the building is as little affected as possible, might factor into your decisions there. All right, I think we've got 5 minutes to go, so we'll close the questions up there. I'll invite everybody now. We'd love for you to sign up to webinar 2. This is next week, same day, same time, and it's more stories from the field. So this is shaping up to be a really interesting webinar. We've got Toby Kent, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. He has a really diverse work experience over his 25-year career in sustainability, where he was the Chief Resilience Officer for Metropolitan Melbourne as part of the Rockefeller Foundation's groundbreaking 100 Resilient Cities program, and spent time as with the ANZ Bank as its global head of sustainable development. So he'll be talking about his experience of climate resilience and climate adaptation, and getting managers and high-level staff executive on board. We will also be joined by Michelle Richards, who's a director at ResilientCo, and she has a real depth of experience working in organisations to build capacity and organisational resilience through crisis management, business continuity planning, and emergency management. So she'll be talking about what she's seen and changes she's seen in the space, doing business continuity planning and managing climate-related risks. And then lastly there, we're lucky enough to be joined by Kelly McKinney. He's the Vice President of Emergency Management and Enterprise Resilience at NYU Langone Health. So he will be dialing in from the US. He's the former Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Office of Emergency Management, and has had a leadership role in every major disaster in New York from the last 20 years. So this includes the 9/11 attacks to Superstorm Sandy to COVID-19. So he'll be talking about his experience of business continuity and bringing in best practice international examples as well. So it'd be great if you could sign up there. And then before everybody hops off, we'd really appreciate if you could please scan this QR code and do a short evaluation survey. This will just help us understand how useful you found the webinar and the direction City Switch could go for future work in this climate resilience space. So I'll leave this one on the screen and everybody can take 2 minutes. It really is very short to do that now. Thank you very much for attending. Really hope that you got something out of this. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you next week.